Good morning, a good devach. Today is Sunday, 2 days before Rosh Hashanah. I guess that makes a Chavches Elul. Baruch Hashem. It's a busy time, but we're learning a Perek a day. Today we're learning Perek Hey of Demai, Mishnah is Demai, and today we're gonna have Shir today, tomorrow Rosh Hashanah, Thursday Some Gedaliah, and Friday Shabbos. There will not be any Shir on Rosh Hashanah. We will continue with today's Perek Hey, tomorrow's Perek Vav, and we'll do Perek Zion on some Gedaliah, and then start the next Masechta on Friday, Rosh Hashem. Okay, today's Shir is sponsored Lila Nishmas Aaron Nachman ben Simcha Cohen, Yeshua Mordechai ben Shepsel, Baruch Asar Bashmol Leib, Binyam Moshe ben Yosef, and the Shemas have an Aliyah. And for Shlev Adasar Basleya Besok Shar Choli Yisrael. Okay, Perek Hey is a little bit of a long one, so hang in there, and we'll get through it. Halokei Mishnah Aleph. Halokeach min anachtom. If you're buying bread from a nachtom, what's a nachtom? You're going to see in this chapter we have three different types of people. With nachtom, we have a palter, and later on, towards the end of the perek, you're going to have a manpul. Three different professionals when it comes to baking bread. We're going to talk about all of them in their proper time. So a nachtam, consider him to be like the manufacturer. He's he. Okay, let's also before we get into that, let's also remember again. We have truma, meiser rishon, meiser sheni, meiser ani, and we have truma. Truma is what we give, what the Israel gives to the Kohen. That's 2% of the crop. It's about 1/50th. It's about 2%. Then you give, and that is a chiyuv misa, I believe. If you don't give it, that's why it's more machmir. And the Amaratzim are very careful of meiser because that's such a severe penalty. If a non-Kohen eats it, or he's not mafish it, there's serious consequences. And then you have, and then you have my Sarishon, which goes to the Levi, which is 10%. 10% after you give the 2% to the Kohen, you give 10% to the Levi. And the Levi has to give what's called Trumas Meiser, has to give Truma from the Meiser. The Levi got 10%, and from his 10%, he has to give a Truma to that, which is basically, let's say, 10% of the 10%, which is 1% of the whole 100, goes to the Kohen. So in essence, the Kohen is going to get 3%, two directly from the farmer and one from the Levi. That Ketumas Meisers also has severe penalties for not giving it properly. Then we had Meiser Rishon, which goes to the Levi. Meiser Rishon is a mama's din, but there's no severe penalty for a Yisrael can eat a Meiser Rishon, not a severe truma, but it's a mama's din, and it's on the Levi to make the claim against the Yisrael if it's not given. But so he has to be mafresh it. If he doesn't give it, it's not that big a deal. And the same thing goes for Ma'aser Sheni. Ma'aser Sheni, the farmer can eat himself because he just had to bring it out to Yerushalayim. So he has to be mafresh Ma'aser Sheni, and he has to, but he can still eat it even though he's mafresh it. And then Ma'aser Ani goes to the poor person. Again, so he has to be mafresh it, not necessarily does he have to give it. So today, on top of all those things, which we discussed previously, now we're going to talk about challah. Challah is a manis kahuna, similar to Trumas Meiser and Truma. It's a gift to the Kohen, but it's only taken off of dough. It's not applicable to anything else. That's what I haven't spoken about it yet. So now we're talking about. So now we're talking about if someone buys bread from a baker. So how does he take meiser from the bread? Now we're talking about a manufacturer here. We'll see why that's important. So no tel kedei trumas meiser v'challah. So the first step, first he takes off a portion. He takes off a portion of the loaf that is sufficient for both trumas meiser, which is 1/100th of the loaf, and challah, which is 1/48th of the loaf, which is like 2%, almost. Um, and and he says, "Echa mimeya mima shigesh kan hare b'sad ze meiser." So 1/100th of what is here, I mean 1/100th of the entire loaf, is hereby designated as the meiser rishon on this side of the mark. He puts a mark on the bread. Ushar meiser samach, and the rest of the meiser rishon, another 9/100ths of the loaf is designated next to it on the other side of the mark. And therefore a tenth of the loaf is now designated as meiser rishon. One tenth of that meiser rishon is for challah, and the other 9/10 is for meiser rishon. The buyer now says the following: this tenth on the first side of the marks that I just made it in to just made into the meiser rishon is hereby made into trumas meiser for the rest of the meiser rishon. It is giving trumas meiser. And the remainder, what's on the first side of the mark, is hereby made into challah. If you can see over here in the picture, you can see this. You have here in the picture, you have a loaf of bread, and it's not so clear in the screen, but the first part is going to be challah, and then you have chumas meiser, and this is meiser rishon. It looks like a finger, but it's like a loaf of bread, and the rest is all chullah. Hope that was clear enough. Right. And meiser sheni, it's not after you designated truma, chumas meiser, and challah, and all that stuff. In meiser rishon, now meiser sheni b'sfono of the romo umechul alamos. But I got designated meiser sheni. So meiser sheni is taken on the northern side of the loaf or on a southern side, meaning the right or left side of the loaf, and it is hereby redeemed unto coins, which he has set aside for this purpose, and he takes the coins and he brings them to Yerushalayim, and he can eat the rest of the bread right here, right now. Mishnah Beis. I wrote Sela Hafrish Truma Trumas Meiser Ka'achas. So now, if he wants to so now how do you we were talking about the first person was talking about Demai, which is questionable what status it is. Now we're talking about how to separate Meiser from dough that is tevel, which is rather tevel. It's a more chomer. So as in the first Mishnah, he wants there'll be some similarities and some differences. So someone who wants to separate Truma and Trumas Meiser at one time from Tevel, Vada Tevel, he does the following. No tel echa bishloshim ushalosh shlish. He marks off in the pile one part from 33 and a third, meaning 3/100ths of the pile. The Omar, he says, Echad mimeya mima sheyesh. On 1/100th of what is here, mean 1% of the pile, harei zeh b'tzad zeh chulin. It's hereby set aside as chulin. That's not no kedusha on this side of the area that is marked off. And the rest of what is in the marked area is designated as truma for the entire pile. At this point, 2/3 of the marked area has become truma, and 1/3 of the marked area is not truma, but simply teva. So now we took care of truma. Now he's got to take care of ma'aser rishon and truma's ma'aser. And the 100th chulin that is here, right? Harei zeh besides zeh ma'aser is hereby designated on this side of the marked area as ma'aser rishon. With shar ma'aser samachol, and the rest of the ma'aser rishon is designated next to it in the unmarked area. Right? So zeh sisi ma'aser also chumas ma'aser alav. That the section of the marked area that I just made part of ma'aser rishon, that this made this in the ma'aser rishon is hereby made into chumas ma'aser for the rest of the ma'aser rishon. He's elevating it to a higher status. The shar challah ma'aser sheni b'sfono of betramo of b'chol alamos. And okay, now we get ma'aser rishon. Now let's get ma'aser sheni. Ma'aser sheni, so the ma'aser sheni, which is 1/10 of the remainder of the pile, is designated in the pile's northern or southern side. And it is thereby redeemed onto the coins that he set aside for this purpose, and then he brings those coins to Shalayim to enjoy there. You see it. You see in this picture. Here you have the pile, the dough, and over here is the truma. It's very blurry. I apologize. And over here you have chumas meiser, and over here meiser rishon. So meiser sheni would come from the rest of it. Okay. So now, okay. So now we have a question of if you get lows from different people, what the story is. So if you have some loaves that are, can you be mafresh? Excuse me, change the seasons over here. Can you be mafresh if you have stuff, if you have produce or dough that is vadai tevel versus demai, or if you have at different levels, can you be one's chayev in ma'aser and one's putter? Can you be mafresh from the putter for the chayev and from the chayev for the putter, or vice versa? Can you mix up the categories? We're going to see the different halachas in that. Halakech the Mishnah Gimel. Halakech benanachtam. If someone buys bread from a baker, they loaves of bread. Ma'aser menachama ala tzanes. But he may separate ma'aser from the hot loaves, meaning the fresh ones, while it's still warm from the oven. For cold loaves that are from yesterday's bread. I mean, tzanes ala chama. Or you can separate ma'aser from the cold loaves from yesterday's bread for the hot ones that came in today. Feel it some harmony, and you can take ma'aser from one day's bread, even if the loaves are baked in many different molds and are different shapes, because we don't assume that just because it uses a different mold, that the grain was from a different supplier. I mean, many times you can take the same grain and make different shapes out of it, and you don't have to assume that the grain came from a different supplier. These are the words of Rebbe Meir. The issue is, where did the grain come from? Did it come from one supplier or did it come from multiple suppliers? If it came from multiple suppliers, then you're going to have an issue of can you take Meiser from one to the other? But Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rabbi Meir. He says, Shani Omer Chitim Shel Emesh Hayib Shel Achim, because he suspects that the wheat used to make yesterday's bread was from one supplier. But today's wheat was um, was from a different supplier. Today's grain that was used for today's bread was from a different supplier, and therefore, if you take meiser, if you meiser today's bread for yesterday's bread, you might be taking meiser on behalf of produce that's already exempt, or the opposite. That's a problem. Um, right. So both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, they both agree that different shaped breads doesn't mean anything. Okay, but the only concern, the only dispute is whether bread's baked on different days. Okay, so now we're bringing a third opinion. Rav Shimon Omer b'tshuvas ma'aser. Rav Shimon says Aser's the taking meiser on one type of mold for another type of mold, being the bread mold, with respect to Chumas Meiser, because he says that the different molds indicate that the wheat came from different suppliers. Because back in the day, each baker had their signature mold, which we're able to which we're able to tell them apart. But it's doing so with respect to challah, but not for Chumas Meiser. Mishnah Dalet. Now, before we had a nacht, now we go to the next guy. Halakech min apalter. Meiser mikol tefus utfus. So the previous Mishnah was talking about a baker, let's say the manufacturer. Okay, usually the manufacturer would have one source where he gets his grain from. Maybe, you know, a lot of these guys, the real manufacturers that they have, there are what's it called? There are fields that produce just for them. They're the only client, and they get all the grain that comes from those fields. So someone buys Demai from a bread shop. Now he's buying large amounts of bread from the manufacturer, and he sells them one loaf at a time. So consider him like a distributor, let's say. So he must separate meiser from the loaves of each type of mold separately. So if you bought bread from a distributor, and there's different types of breads, and then the buyer has to take meiser on each type of bread because they might have come from different bakers. This is quite to be made. He says, no, you can take meiser from one loaf from all the loaves that he bought, even if they're baked in different molds, because according to Yehuda, that the distributor is normally supplied by just one baker. So he's assuming that the distributor basically took the stuff from the manufacturer and distributed it. Let's say, I don't know, you have let's say in Muncie you have your corn's rye bread. Okay. So you have the manufacturer, they manufactured it, and then they have distribution trucks who are distributing their product to the stores. So they're not distributing other breads with it. It's their company. So if you can get nicer from one loaf the whole on the whole thing, because it's coming from one source. Mod the Rabbi Yehuda agrees with her mayor, but the Hamanko, which is the third guy, if someone buys the my bread from a manpo, which is someone who buys right, from many shops who sell to the public. So let's say the distributor is bringing it to the grocery store. Now, the grocery store, for example, or the shopkeeper, he has product coming from all different sources. Okay, so now if you go into the grocery store or to the final stop, to the final bakery, which is getting it from distributor, get it from the from manufacturer, then he has to take Meister on each and every loaf because we're certain that they came from different suppliers. And moving right along. Mishnah Hey. Halakech men ha'ani v'chein ha'ani shenas to go prusos pas. Oh, pilchid devela. Someone buys, if someone buys the Demai produce from a poor person who goes door to door collecting food, so it's coming from different sources. And similarly, the poor person himself who was given pieces of bread or chunks of pressed fig cakes by different people, and it wants to take meiser before eating it. Meiser mikol echad, he has to take meiser from each and every piece. He can't mix them together because got them from different sources, and therefore each piece of food has a different requirement. Some might be exempt, some might be chayiv, some might be biblical, some might be rabbinic, and it's got to be careful about all that stuff. But with tamarim, with guagarus, however, if he bought or is given individual dates with dried figs, or dried figs, no, bolel v'notel, then he may mix them all together by mashing them and mixing them thoroughly and take meister on them as one. Even they came from different sources, it's now one new mixture. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, so Rabbi Yehuda says, Emasai, when can he take meiser on all the dates fixed together? This man shehamtana ruba, when shamatana, only when each contribution of fruit given to the poor person is large, meaning that they give a lot of stuff. When the contribution is small, but they're very small amounts, they're unequal, so you're concerned that they're not going to mix in equal proportions. You have to give meiser from each and every piece before they are blended together. Mishnah Vav. Halakech min asita v'chazer v'lakach mimenu shniyam. That if someone buys the my grain from a grain wholesaler, he goes from the top. And before taking meiser on his first purchase, he then buys them a second time. Not sure it's the same day uh, or time has passed, but he didn't take meiser yet. Lo yasim. You may not take meiser from the second purchase for the first purchase, right? Because the wholesaler gets his grain from many different people, and therefore it is possible that each purchase made by the buyer came from a different farmer, and therefore he's taking meiser on two piles at once, and that's a problem. I feel me also a sug, even the buyer cannot take meiser from one for the other, even if it came from the same bin. I feel me also, even if they're both the same variety of grain, they both are red or both are white, doesn't work because they might still be two different, and that's a problem. Naaman has sita lamar, but however, a wholesaler is believed to say mishal echad, that the grain of both purchases are both from one person. He says this, then the buyer could rely on his testimony, his information, and to give one meiser for two purchases. One thing on, I don't know. They have to hear it from the wholesaler. This came from one person, one source. Moving right along, Mishnah Zion. Okay, now we're talking about someone about buying produce from someone who sells his own produce. I have my own personal farm. You're coming to me. Halakha while buys is one buys the mind from a homeowner, someone who grows his own produce. The chazder will lock up shnia. Then before taking meiser, he buys it from the second time. Goes back for more. Meiser mizeh al zeh, then he can take meiser from both purchases together. I feel mistake kubas, even if the two purchases were from two different baskets of grain, which is different from what we said before. I feel mistake even if they came from two different towns or cities. Since the homeowner sells his own produce, then the status will remain the same no matter what the situation is, because it's all his. Bal habaya shayamocher yar if the homeowner was selling vegetables in the market and someone bought vegetables several times from him, then the law is like this: when when the coworkers, when his workers bring him vegetables from his own gardens, meiser mi'achas and the buyer may take meiser from one purchase from all the other purchases, since all the vegetables come from one person. In the Mishnah's first, as in the Mishnah's first case, umiganos acheros. But when they bring him vegetables from other gardens, from other farmers, meiser mikol echad, then the buyer must take meiser from each and everything separately, and cannot mix them up. Halokeach Mishnah Ches. Halokeach Telo Mishneh Makomos. Someone buys Telo produce from two places, two people, and they each from the buyer that the produce is definitely Telo. Meiser Mizeh Al Zeh, and he can take Meiser from one for both purchases. Since they're both definitely Telo, then they can be used as Meiser for each of them. Have a Pisha Amra, even though the Chacham has said that when you buy from one for the other, you can't do that. You're not really allowed to sell the tevel except for a special need. So you might forget to tell the buyer, and and the buyer will say eat it. So really, it has to be nice before it's sold, unless there's an extenuating circumstance. Mishnah Test. So now we were talking about designating Chuma and Meister for one batch, definitely tell of another. So if even if they're both from different people. So now, what about this case? To start off by saying that we may take Meister from the towel of a Jew for the towel bought from an idol worshiper, an idolater. We shall shall actually Israel, and you can take towel from an idolater, from grain that was bought from an idolater for the towel of a Jew, because both batches are towel are equally subject to the Meister obligation. Misha Yisrael also Kusim may also take Meiser from the towel of a Jew for the Meiser for the towel of that was bought from a Kusi. Misha Kusim also Kusim. And from the towel of one Kusi for another Kusi. The produce of Kusim is also considered towel, and therefore it can be Meiser together with the towel of a Jew or another Kusi. Rabbi Eliezer Oser Mishal Kusim Al Shakusim. But Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with that last ruling, and he says he answers taking Meiser from the towel of one Kusi for the towel of another Kusi, because one of them may have taken Meiser, while the other one may have not, and therefore you have the problem that we discussed at the beginning of the parak. Okay, so now the next two Mishnayos are going to discuss whether regarding Meiser that is biblically obligated versus Maisa that is only obligated derabbanan. Someone's car alarm is ringing outside. Oh, it's off now. Good. Good little distraction. Atzis Nakuf. Hare, this is Mr. Yud. Atzis Nakuf, Hare Zeh Ka'aretz. Produce grown in a flower pot that has a hole in it is like produce grown on the ground. Most flower pots have that hole in the bottom for some reason. Because the plant draws nourishment from the ground beneath it through the hole. Therefore, it's subject to the requirements of Chumas and Maestros, even under biblical law. Tara mi'haaretz al-atzis nakuv. Therefore, someone separated Truma from produce that grew from the ground, from produce that grew in a flower pot with a hole. The atzis nakuv al-aretz are from produce that grew in a flower pot with a hole, or produce that grew from the ground. Truma is a Truma. Then it's a good Truma because the flower pot of the hole is considered to be part of the ground, anyways. But if you separated Truma from produce and flower pot out a hole, but produce with a flower pot with a hole, so therefore the flower pot out a hole is not considered to be part of the ground, and the one with a hole is considered to be part of the ground. So therefore, the one without the hole is the derabbanan, and the one that with a hole is the raisa. Truma, what he separated is treated as truma, but he must separate again, truma again, to permit what grew in the flower pot with the hole. Since the first truma was not effective on the biblical level, it worked on the derabbanan level, but you'd have to give Meiser a good truma again for the flower pot with the hole. Now the reverse case, if he separated truma from the produce of a flower pot with a hole, for the produce of a flower pot without a hole, meaning he took it from a deraisa and a derabanan, truma, what he separated is truma below te'achal as yosi aleh truma. But since it's tevel on the biblical level, it may not be eaten by a kohen until the owner takes out trumas and measures for it. And finally, Mishnah Aleph Taram and Hatamai al Hatamai, that someone separates Truma. Someone separates Truma from Demai. He bought from one Amaretz from Demai. He bought from other Amaretz. Meet Demai al Avadai, or if he separated Truma from Demai for definite. Well, Truma, the Yaksu Yichum, and it's considered Truma, but he has to go back and separate Truma again because it's possible that he didn't do it properly. And then finally, when Avada out of Demai, that if you separate Truma from Truma's Meiser from Demai, one more time, if you separate Truma's Meiser from definite Tevel for Demai, Truma, that is considered Truma, since it is possible that the Demai had not been Meisered. But it may not be eaten by a kohen until the owner takes out its truma and other maestros for it. Because it is possible that the mai already been meistered, in which case the definite tevel was separated as truas meister, it did not become truas meister and is still tevel. It's therefore forbidden to eat it until it is properly meistered. That is the end of Perek. Tomorrow, every Shoshana, we will do Perek Vav. Hopefully, we'll do it at 9 o'clock, but I will keep you posted on the chat. Have a wonderful day.